Story number 1.
The snowstorm came earlier than forecasted. Nate, Sarah, and Jonah weren't prepared for it. Not really. Sure, they'd brought extra blankets, insulated sleeping bags, and enough firewood for 2 nights. But this was different. The wind howled like a pack of wolves, and snow whipped against their tent, threatening to bury them alive. Should we leave? Sarah asked, her voice trembling, though whether from fear or the cold, Nate couldn't tell. Leave and go where? Jonah snapped, his breath visible in the dim glow of their lantern. The road's already covered. We'd get stuck or worse. Nate tried to sound calm, but he felt the same rising panic. They were miles from civilization, deep in the Colorado wilderness. What had started as an adventure to reconnect with nature had quickly turned into a fight for survival. He pulled his parka tighter and adjusted his headlamp. We'll stay put. The storm will pass. But deep down, he wasn't so sure. By midnight, the storm had only worsened. Their tent sagged under the weight of the snow, and every gust of wind felt like a giant's hand trying to tear it apart. Jonah poked his head out to shake off the accumulating snow and froze. What is it? Sarah whispered, sensing his sudden stillness. Jonah didn't respond at first. Then, in a low voice, he said, "There's something out there." Nate crawled over and unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. At first, he saw nothing but swirling white, the snow reflecting the beam of his headlamp. Then, about 30 feet away, he saw them. Footprints. Fresh ones. "Could be a hiker," Nate said, though the words felt hollow. "Who in their right mind would be out here in this storm?" "Or an animal," Sarah suggested, though she didn't sound convinced. "Animals don't wear boots," Jonah muttered. The 3 of them stared at the tracks, which seemed to come out of nowhere and vanish just as mysteriously. The snow filled them in quickly, erasing any hope of following them. They zipped the tent back up and huddled close, their unease growing heavier with each passing minute. It was around 2 a.m. when they heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping. "Tap? Tap? Is that the tent?" Sarah asked, her voice barely audible. Nate shook his head. The sound wasn't coming from the tent. It was coming from outside, from somewhere near the trees. Tap! 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 Jonah grabbed the hatchet they'd brought for chopping wood. "Stay here," he said, his jaw clenched. "Are you insane?" Nate hissed, grabbing his arm. "I'm not just sitting here waiting for whatever that is to find us." Jonah pulled free and unzipped the tent. The cold rushed in like a slap to the face. He stepped out into the storm, his headlamp cutting through the darkness. Nate and Sarah exchanged a look before reluctantly following him. The wind bit at their exposed skin as they trudged through the snow, their boots sinking deep with each step. The tapping grew louder, leading them toward the edge of their campsite. And then it stopped. The 3 of them stood in silence, their breaths ragged. The only sound was the storm raging around them. Jonah shone his light on the trees, scanning the shadows. Nothing moved. Maybe it was a branch? Sarah offered weakly, but Nate saw it before she finished speaking. A figure standing just beyond the tree line. It was tall and thin, draped in something that looked like tattered cloth. Its head was tilted at an unnatural angle, and its eyes, if those were eyes, reflected the light like an animal's. "Who's there?" Jonah called, raising the hatchet. The figure didn't move. "Hey!" Jonah shouted again, stepping closer. "Jonah, don't!" Sarah grabbed his arm, her voice shrill with panic. And then the figure was gone. No sound, no movement, just gone. "Where did it?" Nate started, but his voice faltered. Jonah turned back to them, his face pale. "We need to get back to the tent. Now." They stumbled back through the snow, hearts pounding, and zipped themselves inside. No one spoke for a long time. By dawn, the storm had eased, leaving behind a pristine, unbroken blanket of snow. It should have been reassuring, but it wasn't. Not when they found the footprints. They circled the tent in a wide, deliberate path, dozens of them, overlapping and crisscrossing. Some were boot prints, others bare feet, despite the freezing cold. "Someone's messing with us," Jonah said, though he didn't sound like he believed it. "Who? And how?" Sarah demanded. Nate knelt to examine the tracks. They weren't just around the tent. They led toward the trees, the same spot where they'd seen the figure. He followed them a few feet, his curiosity overriding his fear. "Nate, don't go too far," Sarah called, her voice tight with worry. He didn't answer. The tracks seemed to lead to a clearing just beyond the trees. When he reached it, he stopped dead in his tracks. There in the center of the clearing was a circle of stones. Inside the circle, the snow had melted, revealing dark, frozen earth. And on that earth were symbols, carved, burned, or drawn. He couldn't tell, but they were intricate, unsettling, and wrong. "What the hell is that?" Jonah asked, like coming up behind him. "I don't know," Nate admitted. Sarah joined them, her eyes wide. "We need to leave. Now." They packed up as quickly as they could, their movements frantic and clumsy. The storm had subsided, but the sense of being watched hadn't. As they loaded their gear into their backpacks, the tapping started again. This time, it was closer. Tap! 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 Nate turned, his heart hammering, and saw the figure again, closer than before. Its head tilted, its hollow eyes locked on him. "Run," he whispered. They didn't need to be told twice. They bolted down the trail, slipping and stumbling in the deep snow. The tapping followed them, relentless, until they reached the road where their car was parked. They threw their gear into the trunk and climbed inside, slamming the doors behind them. Jonah fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking before starting the engine. As they drove away, Nate glanced in the rearview mirror. The figure stood at the edge of the forest, watching them leave. It didn't follow, but Nate couldn't shake the feeling that it didn't need to. They didn't talk about what they'd seen, not to each other, not to anyone, but every so often, Nate would hear it in his dreams. Tap, tap, tap.
Story number 2.
The first flakes had just started falling when the three of us, Alex, Megan, and I, arrived at the trailhead. The ranger had warned us about the storm earlier that morning, but we brushed him off. We'd been planning this winter camping trip for weeks. Besides, Alex had joked, "It's just snow. We're built for this." By nightfall, it was clear we weren't. The snowstorm hit hard and fast, turning the peaceful woods into a roaring white nightmare. Our tent, pitched in a small clearing near the tree line, buckled under the weight of the snow piling up on its fabric. The wind screamed through the forest, making the towering pines sway like fragile reeds. "I told you this was a bad idea," Megan muttered as she pulled her sleeping bag tighter around her shoulders. Her face was pale in the glow of our lantern. Yeah, Alex grumbled, digging through his pack for something to reinforce the tent. Hindsight's 20/20. "Can we even leave if it gets worse?" I asked, my voice shaking as much from fear as from the cold. Alex glanced at me, but didn't answer. None of us wanted to admit it, but we were stuck. The trail was already buried under a foot of snow, and the storm showed no signs of letting up. Hours passed, though it was hard to tell how many. The relentless howl of the wind made conversation impossible. We huddled together, listening to the groans of the trees and the occasional snap of a branch succumbing to the weight of the snow. Then, somewhere in the cacophony, we heard something else. It was faint at first, a distant crunching sound, like boots on snow. "Did you hear that?" Megan whispered, her eyes wide. Alex froze mid-reach for his water bottle. "Probably just an animal," he said, though his voice wavered. "Animals don't sound like that," I said. The crunching grew louder, closer. "It's probably another hiker," Alex said, his tone more for himself than us. "Lost, like we are." "But who hikes in this storm?" Megan's voice rose, teetering on panic. None of us moved as the sound circled the tent. Crunch, crunch, crunch. "Hello?" Alex called out finally, his voice breaking the tense silence. The crunching stopped. For a moment, all we could hear was the wind. Then something, or someone, dragged a hand down the side of the tent, the fabric bowing inward slightly under the pressure. I felt my breath hitch, and Megan grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my jacket. Alex fumbled for the hatchet he'd packed, his eyes darting toward the tent flap. "Who's there?" he shouted, his voice trembling. No response. "Go away!" Megan screamed, her voice cracking. The dragging stopped, replaced by a faint tapping on the fabric, deliberate, rhythmic. Tap! 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 "What the hell?" Alex whispered. I wanted to suggest looking outside, but fear glued me to my spot. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the tapping stopped. We sat in silence for what felt like hours, listening for any sign of movement. Finally, Alex whispered, "I'll check it out." "Are you insane?" Megan hissed, tightening her grip on my arm. "We can't just sit here," Alex said. "What if someone's out there?" He unzipped the tent slowly, the sound painfully loud against the quiet. Snowflakes swirled in, and the cold hit like a slap to the face. Alex stepped out, hatchet in hand, his headlamp cutting through the darkness. "Do you see anything?" I called softly, my voice barely audible over the wind. "No," he said after a moment, but his tone was uncertain. Reluctantly, Megan and I crawled out after him. The clearing was eerily still, the storm momentarily easing. Fresh snow covered the ground, and then I saw them. Footprints. They circled our tent in a wide loop, then disappeared into the woods. "They're barefoot," Megan whispered, her voice trembling. The prints were indeed human, but impossibly so, narrow, elongated, with toes pressed deep into the snow. My stomach turned as I realized the weight of the person, or thing, must have been enormous to leave prints that deep. "This isn't right," Alex said, his breath fogging in the cold. "We need to leave." "But where?" I asked, panic rising. "We can't even see the trail." Before anyone could answer, a sound echoed from the forest, a low, guttural moan that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. "Back in the tent," Alex barked. We scrambled inside, zipping it up and piling gear against the flap as if it would somehow protect us. None of us spoke. The only sound was our ragged breathing and the storm outside. Then the tapping returned. Tap, tap, tap. It came from above this time, directly over our heads. I stared at the roof of the tent, my heart pounding. The fabric bowed inward slightly as if something heavy were pressing down on it. "What is it?" Megan whispered, her voice barely audible. Alex gripped the hatchet tightly, his knuckles white. "I don't know." The tapping grew louder, more insistent. Tap, tap, tap. And then it stopped. For a moment, there was silence. Then from outside, a whisper. "Come out." Megan's eyes filled with tears, and I felt my own throat tighten. Alex didn't move, his grip on the hatchet tightening. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. No one answered. The voice came again, louder this time and impossibly close. "Come out!" It wasn't a shout or a plea. It was a command. The tent flap suddenly jerked, the zipper moving as if being pulled from the outside. Megan screamed, and Alex lunged forward, swinging the hatchet wildly, but there was nothing there. The three of us bolted. We didn't stop to pack or grab our gear. We just ran, stumbling through the snow, the wind whipping at our faces. The storm had eased slightly, and the pale light of the moon illuminated the forest. The trail was barely visible, but we followed it as best we could, too scared to look back. Then I heard it again. Footsteps running behind us. I glanced over my shoulder and wished I hadn't. A figure was chasing us. It was tall and thin, its body unnaturally contorted, its head tilted at an impossible angle. Its eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, and its mouth hung open in a silent scream. "Keep running!" Alex shouted, his voice hoarse. We didn't stop until we reached the car. Alex fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking as he unlocked the doors. We piled in, slamming them shut, and Alex started the engine. As the car roared to life, I looked back toward the trail. The figure stood at the edge of the forest, watching us. It didn't follow. But its face was burned into my mind. We drove in silence, too shaken to speak. It wasn't until we were miles away, the storm fading behind us, that Megan finally broke the silence. "What was that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. None of us had an answer. We never went back for our gear. A week later, Alex called the ranger station to ask if anyone had reported finding a torn tent and abandoned supplies. The ranger said no, but he did mention something strange. "You're not the first to ask about weird things in that area," the ranger said. "A couple of hikers a few years back claimed they saw, well, they wouldn't say what, but they didn't go back either. We didn't ask any more questions. To this day, I can still hear it sometimes when the wind is just right. Tap, tap, tap." Story the end.
Story number 3.
The snowstorm wasn't in the forecast when Ryan, Tara, and Chris decided to go winter camping in the White Mountains. They had picked a remote trail far from the tourist hotspots, excited to experience solitude and the rugged beauty of a snow-covered wilderness. Ryan was the planner, Tara was the adventure enthusiast, and Chris was the one who always brought the humor, making the cold feel a little less daunting. The hike up to their chosen campsite was beautiful but grueling. The snow started as a light dusting, delicate flakes melting on their jackets. They laughed and joked about the storm the ranger had warned might roll in. It seemed harmless, barely worth mentioning. By the time they reached a clearing near the edge of a frozen lake, though, the clouds had thickened and the temperature had dropped dramatically. They set up camp quickly. Ryan and Chris worked on the tents while Tara gathered wood for the fire. The wind was picking up, whistling through the pines and sending chills down their spines. But they were prepared, or so they thought. By the time they had a fire going, the snow was falling fast and heavy, the forest around them fading into a white haze. They huddled close to the fire, eating their freeze-dried meals and trying to ignore the growing storm. "This is kind of cozy, right?" Tara said, wrapping her arms around her knees. Chris chuckled. "Yeah, if you like your coziness with a side of hypothermia." Ryan shook his head, smiling. "We'll be fine. The storm's supposed to pass by morning. Worst case, we just stay put until it clears." Tara glanced at the dark forest, her smile faltering. "It's so quiet out here. Like, too quiet." "That's the point," Ryan said, poking at the fire. "No distractions, just us and nature." Chris snorted. "And the bears. Don't forget about them." "Bears are hibernating," Ryan said. "Relax." But Tara couldn't shake the unease settling in her chest. She told herself it was just the isolation, the unfamiliar silence. But as the night wore on, that silence began to feel oppressive, almost alive. Sometime after midnight, Tara woke to a sound. At first she thought it was the wind, but as she lay there, straining to listen, she realized it was something else, something deliberate. A crunching noise, like footsteps in the snow. Her heart pounded as she unzipped her tent just enough to peek out. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint orange glow over the campsite. She couldn't see anyone, but the sound was still there, moving slowly around the edge of their camp. "Tara?" Ryan's voice was a whisper from his tent. "You hear it too?" She whispered back. "Yeah, stay in your tent." Chris's voice joined theirs, low and nervous. "What is it, an animal?" Ryan didn't answer. He unzipped his tent and stepped out, holding a flashlight. The beam cut through the falling snow, illuminating the trees, the tents, the frozen lake, but nothing else. The crunching stopped. Ryan turned slowly, scanning the area. "There's nothing out here," he said, though his voice was tight. "Just the wind and the snow." Tara didn't believe him, but she stayed in her tent, clutching her sleeping bag like it could shield her from whatever was out there. Eventually, the sound didn't return, and the three of them drifted into an uneasy sleep. In the morning, the storm had let up, but the sky remained heavy with clouds. Ryan was the first one out of his tent, and he froze when he saw the tracks. "Tara, Chris, you need to see this." The tracks circled their campsite, just as Tara had heard during the night. They were deep, humanoid, but too large and spaced too far apart to belong to any of them. The strangest part was that the tracks started and ended in the middle of the clearing, with no sign of where they had come from or gone. "What the hell?" Chris muttered, his usual humor gone. "Maybe someone's messing with us," Ryan said, though he didn't sound convinced. "In a storm like that? No way," Tara said. She shivered, pulling her coat tighter. "We need to leave. This isn't normal." Ryan hesitated. "We came all this way. Let's give it another night. We'll keep the fire burning and take turns keeping watch. If anything else happens, we'll leave." Tara didn't like it, but she didn't argue. She trusted Ryan, mostly. Still, as they spent the day collecting firewood and reinforcing their tents, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. That night, the storm returned, fiercer than before. The wind screamed through the trees, shaking their tents and snuffing out the fire, no matter how many times they tried to restart it. Tara sat in her tent, flashlight in hand, jumping at every sound. Around midnight, the footsteps returned. This time, they were louder, heavier, circling closer to the tents. Tara held her breath, her heart hammering. She could hear Ryan and Chris whispering to each other, but she couldn't make out what they were saying. Then, something scraped against her tent. She bit back a scream, clutching the flashlight like a weapon. "Ryan?" she whispered. No answer. The scraping stopped, replaced by a low, guttural sound, almost like a growl. Tara couldn't take it anymore. She unzipped her tent just enough to see outside. The fire was out. Snow swirled through the air, making it hard to see, but there was something standing in the clearing. It was tall, impossibly tall, with long, spindly limbs and a face that was wrong. Its features were distorted, its eyes black pits that seemed to suck in the light. It turned its head toward her, tilting it at an unnatural angle. Tara scrambled backward, knocking over her flashlight. She heard Ryan shouting, then Chris, but she couldn't process the words. The thing moved closer, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet on strings. "Tara, run!" Ryan's voice cut through her terror, and she bolted out of the tent, not caring where she was going as long as it was away. They ran blindly through the storm, the snow swallowing their footsteps and muffling their screams. Tara didn't know how long they ran or where they were going. She just knew they couldn't stop. Eventually, they stumbled into a small cave, collapsing against the cold stone walls. Tara was sobbing, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Ryan and Chris sat beside her, equally shaken. What was that?" Chris managed to say. "I don't know," Ryan said, his voice trembling. "But it wasn't human." They stayed in the cave until morning, too scared to sleep. When the storm finally cleared, they made their way back to the trailhead, their bodies aching and their nerves frayed. They didn't speak much, each lost in their own thoughts. When they reached their car, they found something waiting for them. Scratched into the frost on the windshield were 3 words: "Don't come back." Story, the end.
Story number 4.
The snowstorm wasn't supposed to start until morning. That's what the forecast had said. But by the time Jordan, Melissa, and Caleb reached the clearing where they planned to camp, the first flakes were already falling and a bitter wind was picking up. "Let's move fast," Jordan said, his voice firm. He'd done this a dozen times before, always boasting about how winter camping was the ultimate way to connect with nature. Melissa, his girlfriend, wasn't as seasoned, but she wanted to prove she could handle it. Caleb, her brother, had come along mostly out of a sense of duty, not to her, but to the idea of watching over her. It wasn't that he didn't trust Jordan, but there was something about the way the guy seemed to push her limits that bothered him. They worked quickly, setting up 2 small tents under the looming pines. The trees offered some protection from the wind, but the clearing was wide enough to give them a view of the sky, or at least it had been when they first arrived. Now, snow was coming down in thick, relentless sheets. "This is fine, right?" Melissa asked, glancing nervously at the darkening forest. "Totally fine," Jordan replied, flashing her his confident smile. "The storm will pass. We'll wake up to fresh snow and sunshine." "Sure," Caleb muttered, jamming his stakes into the ground. "If we don't freeze to death first." By the time the tents were up, the snow was already ankle deep. They huddled around the fire Caleb had built, trying to ignore the rising wind. It howled through the trees, a low, mournful sound that set Melissa on edge. "Doesn't this feel weird?" she asked after a while. "Like too quiet, except for the wind?" "It's nature," Jordan said, stretching his legs out toward the fire. "You're just not used to it." Caleb raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. He'd spent enough time in the woods to know what felt normal and what didn't. And this didn't. As the hours passed, the storm worsened. The wind whipped snow into their faces and the fire struggled to stay alive. Melissa kept glancing over her shoulder as if expecting to see something lurking in the shadows. "I'm going to bed," she said finally, retreating to her tent. Caleb followed suit, leaving Jordan to stoke the fire alone. The forest seemed to close in as the night deepened. Caleb lay in his sleeping bag, listening to the storm outside. He was just starting to drift off when a sound jolted him awake, a sharp, deliberate snap, like a branch breaking. He held his breath, straining to hear over the wind. There it was again, a crunch of snow, followed by another. Footsteps. He unzipped his tent and poked his head out. The fire had burned low, casting a faint orange glow over the camp. He saw Jordan sitting by it, staring into the flames, but nothing else. "Did you hear that?" Caleb called out, his voice barely carrying over the wind. Jordan looked up, his face unreadable. "What footsteps?" Caleb said, stepping out of his tent. "Someone's out there." Jordan frowned but didn't move. "It's just the wind." Caleb shook his head. "No, it's not." He grabbed a flashlight and shone it into the trees. The beam of light caught only swirling snow and skeletal branches. Still, the feeling of being watched made his skin crawl. "Go back to bed, man," Jordan said, but there was an edge to his voice now. Caleb didn't argue, but as he zipped his tent shut, he kept the flashlight within reach. The next morning, the storm had eased slightly, but the air was thick with tension. Melissa looked pale, her usual chatter replaced by uneasy silence. "I heard something last night," she admitted over breakfast, her voice barely above a whisper. "Like breathing, right outside my tent." Jordan laughed, though it sounded forced. "It was probably Caleb snoring." "It wasn't," Melissa said, shooting him a glare. "It was close, Jordan, like right there." "Did you check?" Caleb asked. She shook her head. "I was too scared." Jordan waved a hand dismissively. Look, it's the middle of nowhere. The only things out here are deer and rabbits. Caleb wasn't so sure. He'd spent enough nights in the woods to know the difference between animals and whatever this was. That afternoon, the snow began to fall again, heavier than before. They decided to stay put, hoping the storm would pass by the following day. But as the hours wore on, the unease only grew. It started with the tracks. Melissa found them first just beyond the clearing, a single line of footprints in the fresh snow. They were large, barefoot, and impossibly deep, as if whoever or whatever had made them wade far more than any person should. Okay, what the hell is that? Caleb asked, his stomach twisting as he stared at the tracks. Someone messing with us, Jordan said, though his face had gone pale. In the middle of a snowstorm? Melissa shot back. No one's out here, Jordan. You said so yourself. They followed the tracks for a short distance, but they ended abruptly, as if the thing had vanished into thin air. No branches overhead, no sign of a struggle. Just nothing. Let's go back, Melissa said, her voice shaking. That night, the feeling of being watched was unbearable. Caleb kept his flashlight on, scanning the trees every few minutes. Melissa refused to sleep alone, dragging her sleeping bag into Caleb's tent despite Jordan's protests. The wind howled, but underneath it there was something else, a low guttural sound like a distant growl. Caleb sat up, his heart pounding. You hear that? He whispered. Melissa nodded, her eyes wide with fear. Then came the footsteps, heavy, deliberate, and getting closer. Caleb unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. The fire was almost out, its embers casting a faint red glow. For a moment he saw nothing, but then a shadow moved at the edge of the clearing. Tall, impossibly tall, with long, gangly limbs. He froze, his breath catching in his throat. The figure didn't move, just stood there watching. What is it? Melissa whispered. Caleb didn't answer. He couldn't. The figure turned, moving toward Jordan's tent. Caleb grabbed his flashlight and shone it directly at the thing. For a split second, he saw it clearly. A gaunt, skeletal figure with hollow eyes and skin stretched tight over its bones. It had no mouth, but its head tilted as if it were listening. Then it was gone. Jordan! Caleb yelled, scrambling out of the tent. He reached Jordan's tent and threw it open, but it was empty. The sleeping bag was still there, along with his gear, but Jordan was gone. Melissa stumbled out behind him, clutching the flashlight. Where is he? She asked, her voice trembling. I don't know, Caleb said, panic rising in his chest. He was just here. They searched the clearing, calling his name, but there was no trace of him, just the snow, the wind, and the oppressive silence of the forest. By morning, the storm had finally passed, but the sense of dread remained. They packed up quickly, deciding to abandon the trip and head back to the trailhead. As they hiked out, Caleb kept glancing over his shoulder, half expecting to see the thing following them. But the forest was empty, eerily so. When they reached the car, Melissa burst into tears, collapsing into the passenger seat. Caleb drove in silence, his hands gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. Jordan was never found. A week later, Caleb returned to the area with a search and rescue team. They combed the forest for days but found nothing. No tracks, no sign of a struggle, not even Jordan's gear. The only thing they did find was his tent, still standing in the clearing. Inside, scratched into the wall of the fabric, were 3 words, "It watches you."
Story number 5.
The snowstorm wasn't supposed to hit until the following morning. That's what the forecast had said when Eric, Maya, and Sam checked the weather before their weekend camping trip. But now, as night descended, the wind howled like a feral animal, and snow battered their tent with a ferocity none of them had expected. Maya sat cross-legged inside, her hands wrapped around a tin mug of lukewarm coffee. This was supposed to be relaxing, she muttered, her voice barely audible over the storm. Yeah. Well, blame Eric, Sam replied, nudging him. He's the one who said it'd be a light dusting at most. Eric held up his hands defensively. The forecast said it would be clear until tomorrow. How was I supposed to know it'd turn into this? He gestured at the sagging walls of their tent. Maya sighed, staring at the lantern's dim glow. The snow outside muffled everything, creating a cocoon of eerie silence between gusts of wind. Maybe we should pack up and head back to the car. Sam shook his head. In this, the trail's already buried. We'll get lost. Reluctantly, they agreed to wait it out. Eric added another log to the fire pit just outside the tent, the flames barely holding their own against the wind. They tried to distract themselves with small talk, but the unease was palpable. Something about the storm felt wrong. It started just after midnight. Maya had been the first to notice the noise. At first, she thought it was just the wind, but as she strained to listen, she realized it was something else, something deliberate. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. Eric paused, his head tilted. "Hear what?" "That tapping," Maya said, her voice trembling. They all fell silent, ears straining, and then it came. Tap, 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 tap. It was faint but distinct, a rhythmic sound coming from somewhere outside. "Probably a tree branch," Eric said quickly, though his voice lacked conviction. Sam unzipped the tent just enough to peer out. The fire had nearly died, the embers glowing faintly beneath the fresh snow. The forest beyond was a wall of darkness. "Nothing out there," Sam muttered, zipping the tent back up. But the tapping continued, growing louder. Tap, tap, tap. "Okay, that's not a branch," Maya said, her voice rising. Eric grabbed the flashlight and flicked it on. "I'll check it out." "Eric, don't," Maya pleaded. But he was already unzipping the tent. Tap, the cold rushed in, biting at their faces. Eric stepped out into the snow, the flashlight beam cutting through the swirling flakes. "See anything?" Sam called. Eric turned slowly, the light sweeping across the campsite. The wind carried the sound of creaking branches, but the tapping had stopped. He took a few steps toward the edge of the clearing, where the forest loomed like a black curtain, and then he saw them. Footprints. "Guys," he called, his voice tight. "Come look at this." Reluctantly, Sam and Maya joined him, shivering as the cold seeped through their layers. The footprints were unmistakable, deep impressions in the snow leading from the forest to their campsite. "Who the hell would be out here in this storm?" Sam asked, his breath fogging in the frigid air. Maya pointed at the tracks. "They're barefoot." Eric felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. She was right. The prints were narrow, with visible toes, as if someone had walked through the snow without shoes. "Maybe it's an animal," Eric offered weakly. Maya shot him a look. "An animal with human feet?" The three of them stood in uneasy silence, staring at the tracks. They led around the campsite in a wide circle before disappearing back into the trees. "We're not alone out here," Sam said, gripping the hatchet they'd brought for chopping firewood. They retreated to the tent, zipping it tightly and piling snow around the edges to block the wind. But the sense of safety was gone. Hours passed, though none of them could sleep. The storm continued to rage, the wind tearing at the tent like a living thing. And then the tapping started again. This time, it was closer. Tap, tap, tap. Eric sat up, clutching the flashlight. "It's right outside. Don't go out there," Maya hissed, grabbing his arm. But the tapping wasn't coming from the ground. It was above them. Eric slowly raised the flashlight, shining it at the roof of the tent. The beam revealed a handprint, pressed into the fabric from the outside. Maya screamed. The three of them scrambled out of the tent, panic overriding the cold. The storm had let up slightly, the snow falling in softer flakes, but their terror only grew when they saw the tent from the outside. Handprints covered it, dozens of them, pressed into the snow and fabric, some small, others impossibly large. "How?" Sam started, but his voice failed him. They turned toward the forest, and that's when they saw it. A figure stood just beyond the tree line, tall and gaunt, its face obscured by shadow. It wore what looked like tattered clothing, the fabric fluttering in the wind. "Who's there?" Eric shouted, his voice breaking. The figure didn't move. Sam raised the hatchet, his hands trembling. "Stay back!" And then the figure stepped forward, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a marionette controlled by invisible strings. "Run," Maya whispered. They bolted down the buried trail, leaving their gear behind. The snow was deep, slowing their progress, but fear drove them forward. Eric glanced back once and immediately wished he hadn't. The figure was following them, its head tilted at an impossible angle. Its dark eyes gleamed in the faint moonlight, and it moved faster than it should have been able to, closing the distance between them. "Keep going!" Eric shouted, pushing Maya ahead of him. The trail blurred in their panic, and they stumbled into a clearing. The storm had erased all sense of direction, but there, in the center of the clearing, stood an old wooden cabin. "Get inside!" Sam yelled, throwing open the door. They piled in, slamming the door shut behind them. The interior was dark and smelled of rot, but it was shelter. Eric fumbled with the flashlight, illuminating the space. The walls were lined with old hunting trophies, antlers, pelts, and skulls, and a rusted wood stove sat in one corner. "Do you think it'll follow us?" Maya asked, her voice shaking. Sam peered out a crack in the door. The clearing was empty, but the forest beyond felt alive with unseen eyes. "We'll stay here until morning," Eric said, though he didn't believe it would be that simple. The hours crawled by. The wind outside had died, replaced by an oppressive silence. And then they heard it again. Tap, tap, tap. This time it came from the roof of the cabin. Eric held the flashlight tightly, scanning the ceiling. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, until it was a steady pounding, and then it stopped. The door creaked open, but there was no wind to move it. "Stay back," Sam warned, raising the hatchet. The figure stood in the doorway, its hollow eyes fixed on them. It stepped inside, moving with a disjointed grace, its feet leaving no prints on the dusty floor. "Run!" Eric shouted, but there was nowhere to go. The figure raised one skeletal hand, and the lantern flickered, plunging them into darkness. When search and rescue teams found the campsite days later, the storm had buried most of the evidence. The tent was torn apart, their gear scattered, and the tracks, both human and otherwise, led deep into the woods before disappearing entirely. The cabin wasn't there. No trace of Eric, Maya, or Sam was ever found.